Glad to have all of you here for this great bill that I think will be very fascinating. Do we have any requests for bill introductions? Yes, ma'am. Major Newhall.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, thank you very much for your support and time this morning. We have 5 bills to introduce this morning, so I'll try and go quickly. The first one is RS number 0552, and that's regarding state active duty benefit parity. So when National Guardsmen are activated for a domestic response, such as a natural disaster, they're on state active duty orders. And as such, they are state employees and not covered under federal pay or benefits. Current statute outlines a medical board process and specific benefits for injury, disability, or death when members are serving on state active duty. These benefits have not been updated in quite some time, and they do not adequately protect members who are serving the state of Kansas during disasters or other like-type missions. So the proposed changes in this bill would be to add a section that effectively ends the previous process and instead covers members under Kansas workmen's compensation. This change will ensure that the Kansas National Guard soldiers and airmen have more efficient and better quality of care, as well as parity of benefits with other state employees.
Are there any questions? Thank you.
The second one is RS 0539, which is regarding the establishment of the Office of Kansas Homeland Security. So Executive Order 1105 appointed the Adjutant General as the Homeland Security Advisor of the state of Kansas and the Director of the Kansas Office of Homeland Security. However, the Office of Kansas Homeland Security doesn't actually exist. It hasn't been established. So therefore, Homeland Security in Kansas is an undefined concept with no allocated resources or formalized structure. So this proposed change would be to add an article to Chapter 48 for Kansas Homeland Security with sections for definitions, establishment, and powers and duties of the Adjutant General. In order to take appropriate measures to detect, prevent, prepare for, protect against, and respond to acts of terrorism or threats of terrorism to the person or property of the citizens of the state of Kansas, and to maintain peace, tranquility, and good order in the state, it's imperative to establish that structure and clearly defined roles and responsibilities within the Office of Homeland Security.
Are there any questions? I should have said on the first one, any objections to the first two? Thank you.
The third one is RS 0548, recognition of general officers. When Kansas National Guard soldiers or airmen are promoted to general officer, they go through a federal recognition process, which includes an extensive background check and presidential and federal Senate confirmation. Current statute states that appointment of general officers shall be subject to confirmation by the Kansas Senate as provided in KSA 75-4315B and amendments thereto. This redundancy is a potential issue as Kansas is home to the 35th Infantry Division, headquartered in Leavenworth, Kansas. The division has a Major General Commander and 2 Brigadier General Deputy Commanders. Due to recent realignment within the National Guard, 35th ID is now aligned with multiple other states for downtrace units. This will provide a bigger officer pool for selection to commander and deputy commander, leading to personnel from other states to serve as a general officer in the state of Kansas. State Senate confirmation may hold up GO nominations and placement in the 35th ID, which could result in the division being transferred to active duty or another state without this requirement. The loss of a Division 4 structure in Kansas would be detrimental to the Kansas Army National Guard. The Adjutant General as a Cabinet Secretary would still be required to be confirmed by the State Senate with this change as prescribed in Section 48203, but this proposed change would remove the language for all other general officers, allowing for greater flexibility in senior officer assignments.
Any objections to this? Any questions? Yes.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions. My understanding is that the realignment happened in 2020. Is that right? And has it now been in effect? Because I was supposed to be in effect with October 2021, and it's gone through. Is right? Okay. Do you know the reason why the realignment was done in the first place?
Yes, ma'am. So I can talk very overview. If you want more information, I can absolutely get back to you. But this was done just across the National Guard. So there's 8 divisions in the National Guard and 27 in the active duty component. And so what they did throughout the National Guard is they realigned each division with their down trace units. So that way you would have a bigger pool of people for that talent management.
Okay. I think that's all the questions I have. Thank you.
Are there any other questions?
Okay, so number 4 is RS 0554 regarding updates to the Kansas Code of Military Justice. When National Guard members are on federal orders, they are under the purview of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, or UCMJ. However, during drill weekends and annual training, they fall under Title 32 and are subject to the Kansas Code of Military Justice, or the KCMJ. Since the 1988 revision of the punitive articles, the UCMJ has undergone several major revisions, where once the KCMJ and UCMJ coexisted with similar language, the KCMJ now lags in not being able to respond to the current needs of commanders. By limiting the tools available to commanders, soldiers and airmen are oftentimes able to get away with conduct that would not be acceptable if they were serving on active duty. So some of the proposed changes would include providing definitions to match those definitions contained in the UCMJ, ensuring overall consistency with UCMJ and the Model State Code of Military Justice as circumstances dictate, removing all references to and sections concerning trial by court-martial, updating language to modernize non-judicial punishment proceedings in line with other military justice changes, and updating KCMJ punitive articles to mimic current UCMJ punitive articles while continuing to exclude serious felonies, for example, murder and manslaughter. Modernizing the KCMJ would ensure that the Kansas National Guard soldiers and airmen are following statutes that are in line with UCMJ and Army and Air Force regulations, and that the commanders have the tools they need at their disposal to properly handle punitive issues.
Questions? Thank you.
Final one, RS 0541 regarding modernization of the Kansas National Guard statutes. So Chapter 48 outlines the makeup and operations of the military in defense of the state of Kansas. This includes administrative, operational, and disciplinary structure of the Kansas Army and Air National Guard. Since the initial adoption in 1901 of the provisions of Chapter 48 and the last significant revision in 1988, the structure and operations of the Kansas National Guard have drastically changed. So Army regulations, Air Force instructions, policies, and procedure now fill previous gaps that required attention of the states. For example, the United States Army now has a robust regulation concerning the collection of amounts owed for lost equipment, negating the need for the utilization and existence of KSA 48-219. These proposed changes would modernize the language in Chapter 48 to ensure that the Kansas National Guard soldiers and airmen are following statutes that are in line with Army and Air Force regulations.
Any objections to this being introduced? Any questions? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Second item of business is final action on 2039 has been postponed till we get everything lined and all the amendments together. So we're going to put that off. There are other amendments. So I will let you know in advance when we'll reschedule that. One other announcements before we get into our main bill today. It's a reminder, we are advised it is a violation of Kansas Open Meetings Acts to correspond with a majority members outside the public meeting. If you receive an email addressed to the majority of the members, don't even answer it. Don't open it up. It's against the Kansas Open Meetings Act. So be very careful of that. I do not think that we need to have say something else, but since I'm a chairman, I should not keep my jokes to myself. Please be advised it's a violation of the Kansas Open Meeting Act to correspond with majority members outside of the meeting. all the emails, please do not reply to this email. It could be a violation of film. That's from our advisors. I appreciate them keeping an eye on us. It should have dawned on me also. So now we hear a hearing on HB 2088. Yes, we did that. We do that. Thank you. I did that on each individual, but we'll do it. Is there any objections to any of the bills being introduced? Thank you. Now, hearing on 2088, we'll have a briefing by the reviser explaining this to us.
Good morning, committee. House Bill 2088 would amend KSA 7522 to authorize the Capitol Preservation Committee to develop and approve plans to place a mural in the Capitol honoring the 1st Kansas Colored Voluntary Infantry Regiment. House Bill 2088 would authorize the Secretary of Administration to receive monies from grants, gifts, contributions, or bequests made to finance the creation and construction of the memorial. The memorial would not require any public funds for its creation or its construction. House Bill 2088 would establish in the state treasury the 1st Kansas Colored Voluntary Infantry Regiment Fund. Expenditures from the fund would be for the purpose of creating and constructing the memorial. House Bill 2088 would take effect upon publication in the statute book. And I'm ready to stand for questions at the appropriate time.
Questions? Any questions? Well, thank you very much. I'd like to introduce Senator Elaine Bowers. She's with us today. Glad you're here. I understand it's the very same one. First proponent will be Representative Nguyen.
Good morning. I'm Representative Valdinia Nguyen, and I'd like to say good morning to Chairman Ellis, Vice Chairman Dodson, and Ranking Member Weigel, and the rest of the esteemed committee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear today. I stand here before you as a proponent for HB 2088. This bill directs the Capitol Preservation Committee to develop and approve plans for a mural honoring the 1st Kansas Colored Voluntary Infantry Regiment and to create a mural fund for the purpose of financing the creation or installation of the mural. Furthermore, I note that no public funding will be used for the mural. Instead, HB 2088 authorizes the Secretary of Administration to receive donations to finance the creation and installation of the mural. 9 years ago, renovations were completed that brought this Capitol back to its former glory, and we are all honored to be able to serve in these halls. This Capitol honors our history. This bill honors the 1st Kansas Colored Voluntary Infantry Regiment with a mural. We are graced with the awe-inspiring John Stuart Curry's tragic prelude located on the 2nd floor of the Capitol, illustrating the coming of the Civil War to end enslavement. A mural honoring the 1st Kansas Volunteers would complement that mural, and expand the knowledge of and honor more of Kansas Civil War history. Specifically, this mural would honor the 1st African-American regiment from a northern state, Kansas. In August 1862 at Fort Scott, Kansas, United States Senator, Kansas abolitionist, and general in the Kansas State Militia recruited and organized the 1st Kansas Colored volunteer infantry. One source stated that they engaged in combat even before the regiment was mustered into service. However, on October 29, 1862, they saw action at the Battle of Island Mound, Missouri, near Butler, Missouri, with a unit of Confederates that resulted in the first combat death of African American soldiers in the Civil War. At the battle, 225 African American troops drove off 500 Confederate guerrillas. Thus, the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry was the first African American unit to serve in the Civil War, and this was more than 8 months before the famed assault on Fort Wagner in South Carolina by the 54th Massachusetts Infantry, chronicled in the 1989 film Glory. Following the Emancipation Proclamation, the regiment was mustered into federal service on January 13, 1863, and was redesigned as the 79th United States Colored Infantry Regiment on December 13, 1864. Not only did the regiment serve valiantly at the Battle of Island Mound, but also at many battles. To name a few, the battles at Reeder Farm, Cabin Creek, Cherokee Nation, Honey Springs, Native American Territory, Lawrence, Kansas, Poison Springs, Arkansas, Fort Gibson, Cherokee Nation, and Timber Creek, Cherokee Nation. The Battle of Cabin Creek was the first during the Civil War that Black and white soldiers were joined into action. At the Battle of Poison Springs, a large number of men were massacred. This regiment suffered heavy losses, amounting to nearly one-half of their men. Their sacrifices were steep, not to mention the Confederate threats of execution on the battlefield or being taken back into enslavement. The massacre at Poison Springs was similar to the massacre of Black soldiers at Fort Pillow, Tennessee, April 12, 1864, by Confederate soldiers under the command of General Nathan Bedford Forrest. HB 2088 is about honoring honoring those who gave their last full measure of devotion and ultimate sacrifice to serving the United States of America. A mural honoring this regiment will not only honor the sacrifices of the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry, but will also further recognize Kansas' role in holding the Union together. If you would like to learn more, there are thousands of sources, but I've referenced a few in my testimony. The Sable Arm, Negro Troops in the Union Army, 1861 to 1865 by Dudley Cornish. Soldiers in the Army of Freedom, the 1st Kansas Colored Civil War's first African American combat unit by Michael Spurgeon. Like Men of War, Black Troops in the Civil War, 1862, 1865 by Noah Andre Trudeau. The Slaves' War, the Civil War, in the words of former slaves by Andrew Ward. Thank you, and I'll be happy to stand for questions at the appropriate time.
Are there any questions? Representative Collins?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just think this is a really good idea. And you mentioned some like Fort Scott and the battle near Butler, Missouri. That's all kind of in the area where I grew up, and so that's kind of interesting to me. But I was wondering which wall is this mural going to be on?
That's left up to the Capital Preservation Committee in consultation with the architect.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Any other questions? If not you, somebody in the future that's going to speak. Most of these men, were they free or ex-slaves or
Correct.
all free?
No, free or ex-slaves. And I happen to bring my source. Also testified our local historian, Mr. Chester Owens, who has forgot more than I will ever know. And then you have a substitute today, Representative Robinson, who's done a lot. And then we have the Historical Society. So,
Fascinating. That's something that should be on our Kansas history book.
yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. How's the artist determined for this?
There's a process. Both Senator Bowers and I were part of the Brown mural process. So once the Capital Preservation Committee determines some of the parameters, then an RFQ is sent out, then an RFP is sent out. Then they make their rendition. The committee chooses from there, and then they're interviewed. So it's a process that took us, help Senator Bowers, 4 years easily. So it's not a fly-by-night operation. And of course, the key is, first, this bill was passed in 2000 and died for a lot of reasons, and there are no public dollars. So when then the artist does is chosen, that's when not so much that's when the fundraising begins, but that's how much the public has to contribute. Thank you.
Representative Weigel?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think you answered Representative Younger's question. What was mine was, you have somebody in mind that's going to do this, or
No.
that's going to be open yet?
Oh, this is just here.
Right.
It has not been released to the public. The Capital Preservation must wait on the legislature then to act.
That's what I wanted to know, is that's open yet?
Oh, no. You're saying, do you have someone in mind? No, there's no one in mind.
Okay. All right. That's all I was trying to.
It's wide open.
Okay. All right. That's what.
To the nation. We did a national search, put it out nationally for the Brown mural, with hopes there would be a local state artist, but it went national.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I just have heard, I think this is on the 5th floor, that when we do get the artist, we need to get permission to be able to use this on state publications, not have to give money to the artists, get that in the contract. So possibly we need to look in that. I think we had trouble on the, so we get a release on that.
Correct.
Representative Hudson?
I'll just kind of rise in support here. When I was first notified, former Senator Olien, who's down in Manhattan with us, called me and said, we have this initiative and can you help? So I came up and I talked to Chairman Ellis and we were ready to launch, and then we find out that Senator Bowers and yourself are already well down the trail. I just might comment that if anybody watched on Martin Luther King Day, there were several programs on the History Channel. One of them, maybe two of them, were done by Ken Burns, which lay out the rich history of the 1850s and 60s when these men were coming from all across the nation into Kansas for the reasons that you all understand, having read history. And then this volunteer regiment was formed beginning in maybe the late 50s and early 60s, and did some very heroic things and might have changed the course of how this part of the Civil War developed in the central states. But the thing that kind of caught my eye was that in many cases, these things have been omitted from the kinds of things we've learned over time. I know in my own case, you kind of zip through history in grade school and high school, and then a little bit in college, if that's your major. But I was telling Senator Bowers that there was a mural that Ken Burns showed with Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders, when they went up San Juan Hill. So the pictures we all see has kind of Teddy in the middle, and you go out 4 or 5 spaces and you see some of the other soldiers. The original picture has a much broader aspect. So you see black soldiers on the external part of this picture in the original, and they were the protection on the flanks that enabled the San Juan Hill to actually be captured as easily as it was. It was still pretty tough, but so those kinds of things in history, I think, are very important. I just encourage you to do what Senator or Representative Wynn said, and that is go online. There's tremendous amount of things you can learn about this volunteer regiment. I would also contrast this, if you recall, we did the Gold Star Memorial last session. That was a little bit different. In other words, we know that we had space on the south side. We priced the obelisk, we priced the plaque, and then we had a fundraising committee external so that no funds that the taxpayers paid would be used. So that was done pretty quickly. Here we've got to go through a much longer process with, particularly when you're putting things on inside the Capitol and that kind of thing, and doing an RFP to get muralists to do it. But we've already contacted some folks that will help us on the fundraising side, and I really think this will be easily done. In other words, we'll get a price, and then this committee will be in place and start raising money against it. And so maybe this time next session we'll be here to approve the emplacement of the mural. That would be my hope. So thank you very much for bringing this. This is a great initiative.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Representative Johnson?
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and want to thank our esteemed colleague from part of the county that I represent also. Do you think we could talk KCK JUCO into getting a specific history class on this? I just think that we need to establish a very specific, I know this is outside of this. If you're not aware, she is a very well-known history teacher at our community college in Wyandotte County. What do you think?
Number one, answer your question. Of course, you know, I don't represent the college
I-
as far as their decision making. And that, of course, if it's for credit, has to go to the Board of Regents. However, I include in my classes, but we also have special topics, non-credit, and Mr. Owens has shared it with the community in his History of Kansas lectures. So the word is out there, but we will get it out further for more of our Kansans to know the history.
With that, just make a couple other comments. As a historian, as for fun, I have visited many of these sites. I did a historical research article that's at the Kansas Historical Society regarding the African-American soldiers, the relationship between Fort Leavenworth and Wyandotte County. Great contact between there, and this is the follow-up. And so on behalf of Wyandotte County, I clearly think this is time to recognize what they have accomplished through a period of time and their settlement, many of their ancestors into Wyandotte County. So I hope that we can all come together on this one very quickly. Thank you, sir.
Senator Dodson?
I just follow up for just a minute. Most of you remember, now we've got the establishment here of this volunteer regiment in the early 60s. And most of us recognize the 9th and 10th Cavalry that were Leavenworth and Riley and all over the Southwest. Now, we've got a monument in Junction City, Kansas, to the Buffalo Soldiers. We've also got a monument on Fort Leavenworth that was dedicated by Colin Powell. So this fundraising effort, to me, that's why I said it should be relatively easy. some of those same people are still here, and they're already notified that this is something we're going to do. So that's why I'm optimistic that this will go easily.
Any other questions? Any other questions? Thank you, Representative.
Let me make it one last comment. There is a mural in Butler, Missouri of the first Kansas. So surely Kansas can do it.
You know, well, on my way to Branson, which
It's another story.
yes, is it downtown or is it in a courthouse? Do you know?
It's downtown.
I will
In the
stop
museum.
and see that.
And take a picture and bring it back. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Nguyen.
Thank you.
very much. Our next speaker will be on proponent, Kansas Preservation Committee, Patrick Zollner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, for the opportunity to appear before you. I am Patrick Zollner. I've been serving as the acting executive director of the Kansas Historical Society, and since the last 6 months or so, chair of the Capital Preservation Committee. And as chair, I am testifying as a proponent. The Capital Preservation Committee was created by the legislature in 2010 to approve renovation proposals in all areas of the Capitol Visitor Center, and the Capitol grounds to ensure the historical beauty of those areas are preserved, and to preserve the proper decor of these areas and approve any art or artistic displays and ensure their historical accuracy. So without going over all of the other history that Representative Nguyen gave, in short, this process has been over 20 years. The previous committee was disbanded when the Capitol was restored. It was recommended that it wait till after that, and then it kind of fell in a gray area. So we're just simply trying to complete this project. At our October 25th meeting of the Capital Preservation Committee, it was unanimous to approve and go forward, and Legislative Services told us we had to have this legislation to make this happen. So we're looking forward. As was mentioned, we will follow the Brown v. Board process. She outlined the RFP process, and look forward to getting this completed. So happy to answer any questions.
Any questions? Yes, Representative Butler.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just kind of, I know I asked you earlier this morning about what it costs for the Brown versus Board of Education mural. Could you kind of tell us what that, just give us an idea of what that one was so that we know what we have to look forward to for the future?
We'll have to dig through the files to get exact. Our recollection is around $125,000. I would have to verify that. As mentioned earlier, there has been no location chosen. At the time of the 2010 report, I think it was because we were under restoration, they said, hey, the visitor center, the North Hall there is a spot, but there are multiple spots. Frank Burnham he's the one in charge and knows where these good areas are. So the location nor the size has been determined, but will be done so through this RFQ process.
Any other questions? Any other questions? Anyway, Patrick Zollner did a cabin for Oskaloosa, Kansas, and it was a long time. It was 1860s. One of the first settlers there, and said it's not a major road, but it was the Underground Railroad. Some people stayed there. My wife thanks you too. Yes, sir. Representative Jim.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm just curious, why a mural versus a statue or something like that? I'm just curious. Cost or?
That's an excellent question, and I don't know if we know the answer. I think it was around the same time as Brown v. Board, and that was, and I think that the legacy of John Stuart Curry still reverberates strongly here and how powerful that is. So it could take other forms, but this committee, at least for the last 22 years, has been focused on a mural.
Thank you. Any other questions? Thank you, Patrick. Oh, excuse me.
This is kind of an amazing moment. you ask about sculpture, there have been quiet attempts to try to get the renowned Ed Dwight to do a sculpture about first Kansas colored and Art Quindero. We haven't been able to get the coordinated alignments in place to even approach. He is a Air Force veteran from Wyandotte County, NASA. His work is appreciated all over the United States, except for in Kansas, I believe. He's in Colorado. He's probably in his mid to late 80s. But this is going back to the mural. Someone like me, I think this is my 16th day where they seated me. Jim Lane's on the side of my hand on the ceiling, and John Brown's over there. And I'm like, and here Dr. Wynn is presenting the first Kansas colored mural, and Mr. Owens is here. I almost need a drink in the middle of the day, but I don't drink. This is just overwhelming. You you have people to pray and push, and then get to this moment, and it's just kind of, that's all I wanted to say.
Thank you, sir. Any other questions? Our next speaker will be Chester C. Owens, Jr., Korean War vet. Glad you're here.
Chairman Ellis, and other members of the committee. First, thank you for allowing me to make a presentation before this committee this morning. As you all can see, I'm a veteran myself, so this kind of holds dear to me. I support HB 2088 because the mural depicts the history of a regiment of brave Black soldiers who fought for their freedom. They had been enslaved men. Many had families, and they felt that they were duty bound to fight for their freedom. The vast majority were escaped slaves from Missouri and Arkansas who had sought refuge in free Kansas. President Abraham Lincoln had not approved recruiting Blacks for enlistment in the Union Army. The regiment was recruited without federal authorization and against the wishes of Secretary of War Edward M. Stanton. Senator James Lane, also General Lane, authorized raising the regiment August 4, 1862, which was before the Civil War began. The history of these brave men is virtually unknown, and a mural of the 1st Kansas Colored Volunteer Infantry would depict the bravery of these men. The 1st Kansas Colored Volunteer Infantry was the first Black troop to engage the Confederate Army in the Battle of what is now known as Island Mound. Y'all excuse me, I have a little problem, not a spring chicken anymore. The battle is known as Battle of Island Mound, which occurred in Bates County, Missouri, near Butler. They were outnumbered 5-1, but they prevailed in the battle. They were the first Black troops to die in the Civil War. Guerrilla chieftain Bill Truman stated that they fought like tigers. The 1st Kansas Colored Infantry was mustered in the United States Army on January 13, 1863 at Fort Scott, Kansas. There were 600 enlistees. The 1st Kansas Colored Infantry engaged in several battles: Island Mound, Redeemer Farm, Cabin Creek in Oklahoma Territory, Honey Springs in Oklahoma Territory, Timber Farms, Flat Rock, and Poison Springs in Arkansas in 1864. The black troops knew they would be treated by the Confederate Army than the white Union troops. If they were captured, they would not be treated as prisoners of war, but would be executed. This happened at Poison Springs. Remember, Poison Springs became a battle cry for black troops in the United States Army. In spite of this, the brave men wanted to fight for their freedom. The 1st Kansas Colored Volunteer Infantry were the first black troops to fight alongside of white troops in the Civil War. This battle occurred as the battle known as the Battle of Honey Springs in Oklahoma Territory, July 17, 1863. This battle was the single largest Civil War battle in Indian Territory. The Battle of Honey Springs was a deciding moment for the soldiers, and their abilities were questioned after the Battle of Poison Springs. General James Blunt, the commander of the Battle of Honey Springs, was particularly impressed by the performance of the 1st Kansas Colored Volunteer Infantry at that engagement. He stated, "I have never saw such fighting as was done by the Negro Regiment. The question that Negroes will fight is settled. Besides, they make better soldiers in every respect than any troops that I have ever had under my command." A mural of the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry will not only make Kansas aware of the regiment, but will tell the story of these soldiers. Because of the mural, because of the movie Glory, it usually is assumed that the 54th Massachusetts Infantry was the first black regiment to engage the Confederate Army in the Civil War. I have personally involved myself in making this history known for a number of years. I was a reenactor of the 1st Kansas Colored Volunteer Infantry for about 5 years. I was present in reenactment uniform when the 1st Kansas Colored flag was unfolded at this Capitol a few years ago. And I traveled to Honey Springs, my wife and I, to view the first reenactment where black reenactors were involved of the battle that occurred there about 15 years ago. I carried a replica of the original flag of this event, and it was used in the reenactment. This regiment lost at least 354 men during service. 5 officers and 173 enlisted men were killed or mortally wounded. 1 officer and 165 men died of disease. No other Kansas regiment lost more men than the 1st Kansas Colored Volunteer Infantry. Passage of HB 2088 would not only be information for many Kansans, but would become a meaningful part of history for the country. I also did a reenactment years ago as part of a group in Butler County, Missouri. And now they have a statue there depicting black soldiers, and it's done in memorial to that battle in Bates County, Butler, Missouri. And so it would seem almost not a travesty, but it would seem that it would make us more want to have a mural here in the state of Kansas, since we engaged the state of Missouri in a number of battles. Thank you for allowing me to make the presentation. And just kind of excuse me out. In a couple of months, I'll be 90. And so I thank all of you for your service and what you do. Have any questions?
Are there any questions?
Mr. Owens, thank you very much for being here this morning. Thank you for your service in the Korean War. And we talked about that earlier this morning on the elevator. So it's great to know and understand where you come from with this and for your passion for this mural to be put here into the Capitol. Do we know, and maybe that's for you or Representative Nguyen, do we know if there's any descendants from Lieutenant Minor or Captain Matthews from the regiment?
Not from Matthews, but I have a classmate, my graduate from Sumner High School in Kansas, by the name of Rudolph McCullough. When we had the sesquicentennial here a few years ago, we carried the flag at the banquet, and there were two descendants. Rudolph McCullough, from his father was in the First Kansas Corps, and Johnson. He was really the one who kind of kept us together. He is now deceased, but Rudolph McCullough, who also was a Korean vet, who has a story to tell about what happened in Korea, he's still alive and lives in Johnson County.
Any other questions? Thank you, sir. You did a great job. Next proponent, Scott Snyder, a historian. I didn't say attorney.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. I'm Scott Schneider here on behalf of myself. I do have other clients that I lobby for in the building, but this issue fascinated me when I saw the bill, and I can't say it any better than Mr. Owens said it, but I want to give you a little flavor of some of the research that I did last fall. I was actually researching the first Lutheran minister to come to Kansas, and I keep running across his service history, and fast forward, he ended up being the chaplain for the second colored volunteer infantry, and these pieces fit together, and I think it's interesting. So I went upstairs like any historian would and checked out a book that Reverend McAfee wrote as the adjutant general later in his service. And it tells the story very similar to what Mr. Owens was saying. The first colored infantry started in Fort Scott and made their way into Baxter Springs. One of the first stories that's told in this book is how gruesome it was to fight the Southerners because they would not hand over the black members. And one of the stories is there was this Major Livingston who would hand over the white prisoners of war, but not the black. And they murdered the one gentleman. And at the time, our commander says, well, two can play at that game. And we had prisoners of war and we shot one of them and we gave him to Mr. Livingston. And that settled this idea that we're going to shoot our prisoners. But it is told really well in this story. And it was a horrible moment. And in my testimony, I write a little bit about how the moment was so hard and had a tendency to unchristianize very decent men. But I think the more important thing is the mission of the first colored went all the way down to Fort Gibson, which is in Oklahoma. And then the second colored kind of starts at Fort Smith, Arkansas. And I asked the historian at the National Guard, do you have anything on Reverend McAfee? And he says, yeah. And so he sent me this paragraph, and it talks about how the second organized refugees from the South to move in to Kansas. So basically what you have is the first captured a rail line and moved armament to supply the forces as we pushed south. And at the same time, the second was a refugee depot in Fort Smith that was moving thousands of former slaves into Kansas. It's a it's a wonderful story if you put these pieces together. And that's really what I want to come up and say, that this is a Kansas story. It's a uniquely Kansas story. And even from a Lutheran minister, as you weave through history, you see how this is about us as a state. Other states have stories. We have stories. I don't think we tell them very well. And this would help tell a piece of our story. Fast forward, the commander of the second was Solomon Crawford. He ended up being the third governor of the state of Kansas. And McAfee was his assistant, and later was the adjutant general, later the mayor of Topeka. He wasn't a perfect man because he supported prohibition, but fast forward, it is a very interesting story, and I think we need to tell it, and I think we need to retell it. So with that, I'll stop.
Are there any questions? Lieutenant Collins?
I just wanted to thank you for telling that story because you mentioned going from Fort Scott to Baxter Springs, then on to Fort Gibson, and the military highway between Fort Scott that goes to Baxter Springs and then Fort Gibson goes right next to my house where I live. And you mentioned Governor Crawford, and I live in Crawford County, so so it really brings to light a lot of the history in my area.
Any other questions? I have one. Oh, yes. Yes, sir.
Thank you. You asked about descendant. I know that the Rigsby is on the marker in Scott. They still have descendants there in Wyandotte County. And you have to really dig, like Mr. Owens was saying. It's a life-ending journey, but we do know that former U.S. Senator Sam Brownback pushed for the Smithsonian to establish the National African Museum of Culture and History there in Washington, D.C. We had a presenter come to do something World War I museum, who was staffed there many years with the military. And he said when you go to the 5th floor, they have the double V, Valor and Victory, Valor and Victor, and there, as you go up the escalator, first Kansas colors right there. In the Smithsonian facility in D.C. Then 2 Emmys were won about the first Kansas colored in 2015. Missouri State Parks and the Missouri State Historic Society, in conjunction with the Bates County people, won 2 Emmy Awards for cinematography excellence and for historical precise accuracy, with the late Dr. Jimmy Johnson had helped just before the documentary was released. And then in the year of 2022, this guy named Kareem Abdul-Jabbar was nominated for an Emmy for the first Kansas Colored, a short narrative documentary. He lost to former President Barack Obama, who did the national parks. There's a movement across the country to, I'm one of the people that like critical race theory, because the history of our state broke through all of that. There's no need in trying to reinvent the wheel and reestablish it if you spend the time going through the dusty books and get on the nerves of the librarians and professional expert people, ask them to help interpret and decode. We have an incredible lineage. My last little thing I wrote is that Black history is American history, which is international humanity. This moment is really quite substitute.
Any other questions? Would you please explain that book, how you found it, how old it is? Research?
Yeah, one thing I do want to point out that there is a gentleman who is a presidential appointee to the National African American Museum, and Dr. Eric Sexton. You'll see him in the halls a little bit. So he does have kind of firsthand experience of how that museum got built as a Kansas appointee to that commission. So it's a fabulous story. I just went up to the library looking for anything that had Reverend McAfee's name on it. I didn't know that the history actually existed. I didn't know that he was adjutant general at one point. but the library did, and this was the one book that he wrote. It's the first history of Kansas military, and it has 17 of the first regiments, and then 4 of the first colored volunteer infantry. And it's the notes of every commander, and that McAfee spent the time putting into a book. So it's a fascinating read of snippets of things that might not be other places. It is digitized and it's online now in several very large libraries, they tell me. So 1861 through 1865. So we think it's written right after 1865. So
Any other questions? Thank you.
thank you.
That concludes our proponents. Any opponents? Any neutrals? That concludes our hearing on 2088. We will work this on Tuesday. I don't think it'll take very long. One announcement before we adjourn. Remind you that the Kansas Open Meetings Act correspondence, be very careful. Do I hear a motion to adjourn? Motion, second? All in favor? Say aye. I'm not going to say negative. Have a great day. Thank you.